Getting to Zero handout about ways in which we project and deflect when we're triggered. And then this whole idea of resting in that wheel of awareness. So being able to rest in capital S self, like there's so many different ways that we talk about this. Being able to have a metacognitive state where we can observe what's happening for us. We can observe what's happening for the other person, right? So when we're in that state, we're in the driver's seat. And so what's popping up for me around that is the whole somatic experiencing paradigm, where they talk about the changing channels and observing the different channels, the times. You both might have seen that. So the times channels. So when we're in these states, if we can observe independently our thoughts, images, need for movement, emotions, and sensations. So those are the times channels. So basically our embodied experience when we're in an activated state or even a non-activated state, we're scanning our inner environment for those embodied experiences. So the idea is that we can zoom in on one of those channels, and we can change the channel too. So if we're stuck in our thinking, right? If we're stuck in our cognitions, we could start to scan our inner experience and shift from cognitions to, let's say, felt sensations within the body. Just give me a minute to pop these up. Yes, you can see. And this comes from the Getting to Zero book by Jayson Gaddis. I was just seeing if his name was on the form, but it's not. And the idea is that, when we're seeking to restore or repair connection, we want to get to this zero zone where we're co-regulated. And when we're triggered, right, it's like we're moving up the trigger ladder, you could call it, right, where we're going from 0 to 10. The more awareness we have, the more capacity we have to sit in that metacognitive state or the wheel of awareness, we can actually slow this down, right? But many of us just go from 0 to 10. We flip our lid and we're not even observant that there's all these different things happening before we got to 10. Following so far? Okay, so if we take Dan Siegel's teachings, for example, and his notion of flipping your lid, where there's so much alarm in the system and the limbic system goes on fire, and now our prefrontal cortex, or our capacity to sit in metacognitive state, is offline, right? That's the whole idea of flipping your lid. And so that would be going from 0 to 10. So typically what ends up happening is that we have developed protective patterns, right? Would you agree? We have developed these, sure, Freud called them defense mechanisms. Protective patterns is much nicer. So we're just going to use the term protective patterns, meaning that when we are highly dysregulated, we're in conflict, or there's risk of separation and disconnection within our attachment system, then we're going to move towards those protective patterns that would have been developed in our younger years. So some of the major protective patterns which correlate with attachment theory, right? So you talked about avoidant attachment style and anxious attachment style. So over here, we've got what I think was his name, Stan Tatkin would talk about with the islanders, right? Like when we go to the island, we're avoidant. And then over here in the Getting to Zero book, he talks about seeking patterns, which it's like we're a golden retriever, right? We're kind of constantly looking for affirmation. Like, are we okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? So Stan Tatkin, he would call over here this avoidant pattern that you're an islander, meaning that you just like withdraw, retreat, and go to your own little island, and you really disconnect from everything. over here, he would call this the wave. And in other attachment theories, we call this anxious attachment style. Making sense so far? So typically what ends up happening relationally is we're usually either we have the same patterning, protective patterns, or we have opposite protective patterns, which can make it really challenging, or it can help us come back together into zero space. So the purpose of this is that we want to find our way back into connection. Many of us never had the opportunity to sincerely experience what it feels like to have repair and return to this zero state, which we could also say is co-regulation or coherence, right? You can see how all this maps over top of this. So we have avoidant and seeking. So the avoidant runs away, the seeking chases after. Then we also have posturing and collapsing. These obviously make sense, but within the posturing category, this is where we have the grandiose, large personality, kind of, we would even put the quote narcissistic personality here, right? The posturing is we're puffing ourselves up, we're getting in your face, we're pretending like we don't care, it doesn't matter. And we're fighting back, right? Usually when we're posturing, we're preparing to fight. The opposite of that is collapsing. So if we look at this, posturing would be sympathetic. If we're looking at the profile ladder, you know, when we were talking about polyvagal theory, and over here, collapse would be dorsal, right? So we've got more sympathetic going over here. I'm getting ready to fight. Over here, I've given up and I'm moving towards hide, right? Preserve and hide. So these are the four main protective patterns and attachment patterns that we move towards in an attempt to keep ourselves safe and or restore connection. If we can't restore the connection that's so deeply painful to our attachment system, then we'll usually hang out over in these patterns, right? Now, within that, in the book Getting to Zero, he talks about these roadblocks to reconnection. So the purpose being that we're seeking repair. And we know that our nervous system thrives and can rest when we're securely attached or we've repaired the attachment. And so our nervous system can't rest until we come into repair. We know that many of us, let's say growing up in insecure attachment households, we know that we never had the opportunity to experience that rest. And I would argue that there's a high percentage of people who have lived that way, where we had to learn what to do to deflect because it was too painful. This is where the whole performing to attach thing comes into play as well. So if we look at this over here between posturing and seeking, so if we tend to posture and seek, let's just say, we're going to notice that, you know, we've got blaming, right? If you're posturing, what are we doing? We're blaming, we're projecting, we're putting it onto the other person, right? We're making it about something outside of us versus taking ownership that maybe I could be contributing to this too, or even listening. So you know what it's like when you're around somebody who's blaming. There's no entry point. We're not actually de-escalating any of this. It's just causing more frustration. Would you agree? Then over here, if we look at kind of closest to seeking, we've got over apologizing, quick to take ownership. It's all my fault. I'm so sorry. I should never have done that. I can't believe I did that. I made you feel this way, right? So it's this over acknowledging of you being responsible, right? Something, if I take full responsibility here, then I'll restore that attachment. And so remember that it's like, if this worked in the past, it means that things started to de-escalate. if we look over here, again, we're looking at like the things that are closest to each of these protective patterns. So over here, we also got distractions. This is also very familiar, right? So when we're distracting ourselves, what are we doing? We're not actually paying attention to what we're thinking, feeling, or experiencing. We're seeking outside of ourselves to take away attention on all of that. So distraction could also be the what's the word I'm looking for? The motivating urge behind our addictions. Right? I'm going to distract myself by social media, alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping, television, right? Food, work, right? So these are all the ways in which we're trying to shift the attention away from what we're actually experiencing and putting it on something else that's going to distract us from that time and place. Some of these I have to go back into the book to confirm because time, I'm not 100% certain what the deflection is there, except that using a lack of time as a reason for not being able to get the repair. Like, I just don't have time to deal with this right now, I think is what is meant by that one, but I'd have to confirm it. If you have any other ideas, but I think it's more of that, yeah, we just don't have enough time. I don't have enough time to listen to what it is that you need to do. We don't have enough time to restore connection. We don't have enough time to solve this problem, right? We're too distracted, not enough time. So we just sweep it under the rug as what. So over here, we're looking at the things closest to the collapse. And we've got hope and pray. So this is more like fantasy thinking, right? So hoping and praying is going to be different. Maybe you could relate to, let's just get through the day, go to bed, tomorrow's going to be better. So that's more like hope and pray, meaning we're not willing to sit in the discomfort and be sober to the reality that's unfolding in that moment. We're just going to, toxic positivity would fall here too. So yeah, hope and pray could also be toxic positivity, spiritual bypassing. The spiritual bypassing is a term that was developed kind of within the New Age circuits in response to not taking responsibility for kind of the conflict at hand, and then just turning it over to God. So bypassing one's own nervous system, one's own felt experience, one's own cognitive experience about, something that might be a conflict that's happening or a situation in the environment that's happening. And then it's kind of like you're going too quickly to making sense out of it through a spiritual lens. And some of the ways that this can show up is it can feel very dismissive for people if you're working with, let's say, a spiritual leader of sorts, and they're not giving you enough room to be in your own personal experience and your own emotional experience. Let's say you're in, quote, negative emotional experience, and then there's just a really quick overriding that you're maybe creating that experience for yourself, and that you just need to kind of follow whatever the spiritual teachings are of the time, right? Like, so just kind of step into those spiritual teachings, hand it over to God, whether it's universe or God, and and just rest in that, so you don't have to actually do the work to clear that or be responsible for that. So it's a way of, it can be delusional thinking, and it can leave people who are in the role of, quote, student to spiritual teacher feeling like they've been misunderstood, gaslit, or that there's no room for their full human expression. But here's a more simple way. So spiritual bypassing is the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks, essentially sidestepping real-life problems with spiritual concepts. Or spiritual bypassing is a way of hiding behind spirituality or spiritual practices. It prevents people from acknowledging what they're feeling and distances them from both themselves and others. And it's like a fracture. It's like we're fracturing off from our embodied experience versus kind of like the ideologies that we're hooking into. I had that same instinct when The Secret came out. If any of you are familiar with that, the whole secret concept, which is sort of the new age concept of you create your own reality. And my biggest instinct around it was, if that's true, then why do we have so much suffering? And why do we have so much poverty? And then, is it because those people haven't figured this out yet? And so I remember just wrestling with all of these concepts and eventually realizing that, the concept itself is much bigger than what they were presenting, but that the problem was that we were focusing so much attention on the material world and material wealth, right? It was about an accumulation of things, so much of the teachings anyways. Well, I think The Secret, I think even Joe Dispenza was in that movie, The Secret.
Oh, was he?
I think he might have been. He definitely was in What the Bleep Do We Know, which is worth watching. Like it was a good one. It was like revolutionary back in the early 2000s. And I think that these concepts have been around for a really long time, like as long as Egyptian era or even before then, right? Like these are metaphysical concepts about the nature of reality and about energy and about what it means to be an energetic being and how to work with all of that. And and then I think that they just sort of took these very complex concepts and digested it down into a marketable concept that was teaching people that if you align your thoughts with your feelings and you project that out into the universe, in other words, if you're good, like there's this idea of if you're good and you have good feelings and you have good thoughts, you're going to get more good in your life. Which fundamentally, when you look at the teachings, even like that, Joe Dispenza's research team have been studying now for years, there's truth to the messaging that when we align in a coherent state, when we can align a coherent thought with a coherent felt experience and hold that in coherence with our system and just kind of open up to the field, that we will experience more of that. So the teachings are the same. It's just the complexity of it without maybe the judgment that there's a good way of doing this and a bad way of doing this. And that the whole motivation, at least from what I picked up on when I was watching it back in the day, was like, the way I get out of my own hell is by doing this work. But if I don't do that work right, now I'm the cause of my own hell. So it actually created more of a hell for me, if that makes sense. And I think it has for a lot of people, which is part of the reason why I want to run these groups, is because I want us to kind of unhook from this collectively, because there's something there that if we're now holding on to a belief that I'm 100% solely responsible for my experience of this reality, and I can't seem to find my way out, then I'm going to suffer more. And then I see that as being a lie, a really big lie that we've bought into individually. And I see that as actually trapping us. And so part of like the Secret movement was a trap, because it was almost like the yellow brick road. It kind of showed this idea that there is, gold at the end of the tunnel or something along those lines, right? And that this is the path, just follow the yellow brick road. And then you might get some positive return on that, which is going to motivate you to do it more. But then all of a sudden, it's very ego driven in that now it's like my personality is driving that, if that makes sense. My personality being how I'm thinking, feeling, and behaving as a result of my past, right? So all of these parts are attaching to this desire, and it's driving me to do these things in such a way that if they don't turn out, then my other parts are going to come in stronger and let me know that I'm continuing to fail, as a very small example. And so this is where I'm saying we kind of trap ourselves. And so one of the things that I've had to really contemplate is, okay, so some of these principles are true, like they're factually true. We now have evidence to even support how true they are, right? It's true that we are energetic beings. It's true that we are part of an energetic field of energy and information, right? It's true that we're in relation to all that is. It's true that when we're in a state of coherence, which is this like coming together of harmonic like attunement with our inner world and our outer world, when we come together in that state of coherence, yes, magic happens, right? Like, yes, all of these amazing things can unfold because that's our natural state. That's our most elevated state of being. That's what we're moving towards, right? It's true when we're in survival stress, we're in a state of incoherence. It creates distress. It creates disharmony. It creates conflict, right? All these things are true. And so if it's true that our inner reality is projected into our outer reality, and we're basically kind of living in this virtual reality of a movie going on, and that movie has been informed by our past, and we're projecting it into the present. So we're always sort of living from the past. If all of that's true, which there is now enough evidence to support that to be the case, then what do we do with that information? As we're living day to day in these relational exchanges that are really challenging, because we've got all these external factors that make it really, really hard for us to stay in states of coherence. So I think that back in the day, The Secret kind of opened the door going like, look, there's a way through, right? Like just follow the yellow brick road. And people really caught on to that and saw that it just became the next new religion, right? Like they just saw that as that's my savior, right? Now this is my savior. And so going back to your question about what was the difference between The Secret and Joe Dispenza, I think one of the differences is that Joe Dispenza keeps coming back to just keep doing this work, kind of like Byron Katie, right? If we just keep questioning our stressful thoughts, we free ourselves. If we just keep putting our brains into altered states of consciousness so that it can find coherence and congruence, your life will sort itself out. And that's kind of what I keep getting from those two people who I think have done some really good work in this field, is that the more we do that work to enter those altered states of consciousness, to change our brainwave state so we can enter the operating system, and then we can project the new movie, which is basically what Joe's saying, project the new movie, which is no different than when I was studying sports psychology and we were doing mental rehearsal to play our best game, right? My body already knew what to do. So when I got into the day-to-day, where now I have to perform, my body's performing because it's already been doing it in that mind movie for months before, right? So that's exactly what Joe's teaching is. You get into this altered state, you project the new movie, and then you let it happen in real life. You let it come to you. And the hardest thing is that we also are dealing with all of these inner parts, right? We're dealing with our inner environment, our inner community, all these parts that are part of our attachment story. And those parts are kind of in competition for what they're projecting into that new movie. This is getting very complicated, but these are the things that I think about. Right? Because it's like, okay, so why is it not just that easy? Well, because my teenager is projecting into that movie what my teenager thinks she wants, right? It's like Santa Claus. It's like a list of, and this is kind of what The Secret did, is it woke up all these teenagers, where we're walking around as adults, but we want to live like teenagers. And so we're just projecting that we just want all these things, right? No different than, our kids were going to want, or they're going to ask from Santa Claus. And so I realized, okay, that's problematic, because it's not about wanting more things, and it's not about my teenager wanting all of this stuff. It's like, so who's actually building the movie? And are we supposed to build a movie, or are we supposed to let a movie unfold? I don't know. So these are some of the questions, like when we get into that altered state of consciousness. Now, I think one of the most powerful questions to ask yourself is, how do I want to feel? What do I want to feel more of? What do I want to feel less of? So how do I want to feel in my life? So compartmentalizing, which makes sense, right? That this is something many of us are probably very accustomed to, storing it in certain areas so that we don't have to actually face it. It refers to the potential for fracking to become a negligible source of, never mind, getting to zero. Fracking is how you do not want to listen. Fracking won't help you get to zero in your conflicts with others. In fact, fracking is often how most people listen. Notice how it kills the vibe and the connection in these examples, and notice how it could create even more conflict. So then we've got avoiding. So we have defensiveness, which is also a form of projecting. So kind of defending and then projecting. We all know what stonewalling is, where we just can't get through. That's super frustrating. We all know what gaslighting is, where we're made to basically think that we're crazy for having the thought that we were having, or trying to relay the experience that we're having, and we're told that experience is not real. So these are the ways in which we can roadblock ourselves or each other towards reconnection. And then all of you know this, but these S's, right? To be seen, to feel safe, to be soothed, to be supported and challenged. Those are the S's that we need to be able to move towards secure attachment. So when there is conflict, this is what we're actually seeking. In his book, Getting to Zero, he talks about something called LUFU, listen until you feel understood. So that's the process he's developed as a way of coming back to zero. Can you see this? So this is, I think you guys have this handout, but this is where the times charting is. And so this idea of internal channels that you can listen and pay attention to, and you can track and scan. So the whole scanning idea and tracking idea, that comes from somatic experiencing. And so, yeah, the idea, you have thoughts, images, emotions, sensations, and how does your body want to move? This is very somatic, obviously. We don't always pay attention to this, but if you start to pay attention to it, you might notice that, like, oh, I want to throw a punch, or I want to push, or my legs want to run. And the idea is that you want to complete that movement.